Cities in the time of Jesus hide details that go unnoticed in biblical reading. You probably imagine how houses were built or how streets functioned. But the archaeological reality goes far beyond architecture. Leaving home after sunset in ancient Judea was practically suicide. There was no police, there was no light, and the city gates locked you out. The life of Jesus and his disciples was a survival movie. And it is this fascinating and dangerous routine and the wonders of Jesus' world that we are going to explore today. If a camera could fly over Nazareth or Capernaum in the year 30, the first shock would be the color. Everything was monochromatic, a dusty brown of rough stones and mud bricks that camouflaged the houses against the dry hills. Forget the white marble avenues of epic movies. The reality of the cities where Jesus walked was a sensory attack of dust, smoke, and claustrophobia. Descending to street level, the sensation of confinement would be immediate. Because what we call streets were actually irregular, beaten earth alleys that rarely exceeded 2 meters in width. There were no sidewalks to separate people from traffic. So, a simple walk to the market was a physical struggle for space between pedestrians, loaded pack donkeys, and the sewage that often ran down the center of the path. This chaotic layout was not accidental. It was defensive. Houses functioned like small fortresses with thick walls and no windows facing the alley, turning their backs to the outside world because the street was viewed as a place of danger and theft. Life happened on the inside, in the courtyards. But this search for security created a curious sonic paradox. Since structures were glued to one another to save material and maintain structural integrity, soundproofing simply did not exist. In a village of that time, silence was a luxury no one could afford. The community functioned as a single living organism, where thin walls meant you heard the neighbor's argument, the baby's cry, and the grinding of grain in the house next door. Privacy was a futuristic fantasy. Life was lived under the constant auditory surveillance of the clan, where everyone knew exactly what you were doing. And there was a rigid hierarchy of survival in these alleys. If the silhouette of a Roman soldier or a tax collector mounted on a horse appeared blocking the light, the local resident knew the protocol instantly. You needed to squeeze against the dirty mud wall and lower your eyes. In those streets where the only law was force, physical space belonged to whoever held the sword, and the rest of the population literally had to shrink to survive. When you entered a common house in Galilee in the year 30, the thermal and olfactory shock was immediate. Your eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the darkness, but your nose warned you beforehand. The air was hot, humid, and had a strong smell of straw mixed with fresh manure. We expect to find a living room, but what existed was a biological heating system. The architecture of these dwellings did not prioritize comfort, but survival against the cold of the desert night. Without electricity or modern heaters, the solution was to bring the most efficient heat source inside: the livestock. The floor of the entrance was beaten earth, and goats, sheep, and even a donkey slept there. It may seem strange today, but sleeping while listening to the heavy breathing of a 50-kilo animal next to you was not a sign of extreme poverty. It was the rule for most families. The body heat of the animals rose and warmed the elevated stone platform where humans slept, ate, and lived. Exactly at the edge of this platform, separating the people's area from the animals' area, were cavities made in the stone or wooden boxes for the animals' food. The name of this trough was a manger, mangadura. This completely changes the classic Christmas scene we know. When we read that there was no room in the inn and the baby was placed in a manger, it doesn't mean they were expelled to an isolated barn in the middle of a field. They were likely in the main room of a relative's house, which was already overcrowded, forcing the family to settle in the lower part with the household animals. But if winter required this hot and smelly tightness, summer brought the opposite problem. When the heat of the day turned that stone box into an unbearable oven, domestic life migrated upwards. The flat roof, made of branches and packed mud, became the main bedroom. It was the only place one could escape the smell of ammonia from below and feel some breeze. The ancient house was a survival machine, where space was disputed centimeter by centimeter. But if the lack of privacy within four walls seems bad, the true social judgment happened outside, at the only place where water sprang from the ground. Today, when we feel thirsty, we just turn a tap and water appears clean and effortless. But in first-century Judea, getting a simple cup of water was the heaviest and most politically dangerous job of the day. The family's survival depended entirely on the physical strength of the women, who needed to walk to the village spring, often distant, balancing clay jars that, when full, weighed over 20 kilos. Imagine carrying a microwave on your shoulder, under the strong sun, every single day. But the physical weight wasn't the biggest problem. The real challenge was the social weight. The town well functioned as the social network of antiquity. It was there, in the early hours of the morning or late afternoon, that news circulated, marriages were arranged, and reputations were destroyed. That space around the water was a true open-air tribunal, where a woman's absence could be as condemning as her presence. If you wanted to know who was in disgrace with the community, you just had to observe the sundial. Respectable women went to fetch water in groups during the cool hours of the day. Going to the well at noon under the scorching sun was not a choice of preference, but a clear sign of social exclusion. That is why the biblical account of the Samaritan woman going to fetch water at the 6th hour, that is, noon, is a clear sign of social exclusion at noon, says much more about shame than about thirst. She preferred to face the unbearable heat than to face the judgmental looks of the neighbors. And this water, so difficult to obtain, had a curious use. The obsession of the Pharisees and religious leaders was not with bacteriological hygiene, a concept that didn't even exist, but with ritual purity. Washing hands before eating or taking ritual baths in pools called mikvahs served not to kill germs, but to remove the spiritual contamination of having touched something or someone considered unclean. You could be physically dirty with soil, but if you had fulfilled the ritual with water, you were considered clean before God. Water controlled life, hierarchy, and religion. But while life in these Jewish villages revolved around tradition and the well, a few kilometers away, a giant and modern shadow was rising, bringing a visual shock that most people don't even imagine Jesus witnessed. Nazareth versus Sepphoris. The classic image we have of Jesus is of a carpenter living in a quiet village isolated from the world. But geography tells a very different and visually shocking story. Nazareth was not a desert island. Just 6 kilometers away, less than an hour's walk, stood something that seemed to have landed from another planet: the city of Sepphoris. While Nazareth was made of mud and silence, Sepphoris was a vibrant metropolis with 30,000 inhabitants, known as the Jewel of Galilee. Imagine the daily contrast. If you were a young builder, or tekton in Greek, like Jesus and Joseph, you probably walked there to work. You left a conservative village where everyone wore raw wool, and upon crossing the gate of the neighboring city, were bombarded by marble-paved streets, open-air theaters, and colorful mosaics on the ground. For a first-century Jew, entering Sepphoris was an attack on the senses and morals. The cultural shock was brutal. While in the villages, the law prohibited images of humans or animals, considering them idolatry. In the Roman city, you saw statues of pagan gods on every corner. While modesty was the rule at home, in the gymnasium of the neighboring city, men practiced sports completely naked, something abominable to local tradition. This scenario changes how we view the environment of the Gospels. Galilee was not just a rural setting of sheep and shepherds, it was a cultural battlefield. The urban setting seduced young people with luxury, hot baths, and entertainment, while the villages fought to maintain the tradition of the fathers. It was at this point of tension, between the simplicity of faith and the arrogance of the empire, that the Christian message was born. But if the cities offered moral dangers to the soul, the space between them offered lethal physical dangers to the body. Because the moment you set foot on the road to travel from one city to another, the protection of Roman law disappeared, and you entered a territory where geography conspired to kill you. Today, traveling 30 kilometers is something we do in half an hour by car, listening to music and with air conditioning. But in the first century, that same distance represented a journey of 2 whole days that required military planning. Leaving the city gates was not an act of tourism, it was an act of extreme courage, because the road was a lawless land. The most famous and feared route of the time, which connected Jerusalem to Jericho, was known as the Way of Blood. The geography there conspired against the traveler. The road dropped almost a kilometer in altitude in a short stretch, snaking through limestone gorges full of natural caves. For a bandit or political rebel, it was the perfect office. He could observe the victim for kilometers, attack in a blind curve, and disappear into the grottos before any help arrived. Because of this real risk of death, the concept of traveling alone, as we do today, was suicide. No one took the road without company. People formed gigantic caravans, grouping entire families and neighboring villages to create volume and intimidate muggers. This explains a curious detail of the Bible that many find strange. How did Joseph and Mary lose Jesus at age 12 in Jerusalem? They weren't negligent parents. They were traveling in an entourage so large and chaotic that it was perfectly normal to assume the son was with cousins or uncles at the front or back of the group. Besides the fear of being stabbed by a Sepphoris, assassin, there was the logistical challenge of purity. There were no reliable roadside restaurants. A devout Jew could not simply eat at a stranger's house by the roadside, as he didn't know if the food was kosher or if the utensils were pure. So every traveler needed to carry the extra weight of their own survival: bread, oil, dried fish, and wine on their backs, transforming the pilgrimage into a test of physical endurance under the desert sun. If you like discovering what real life was like in these ancient times, comment now. History comes to life, so we can continue bringing this type of content. Roman roads connected the empire, but outside the guarded main routes, terror dominated. However, if the road was the place of fear, the final destination of most of these trips was the place of shock. Upon arriving at the capital, the pilgrim found a city that was supposed to be the house of peace, but functioned like a bloody industry. God's slaughterhouse. Crossing the walls of Jerusalem during Passover, the expectation of finding a sanctuary of silence and prayer disappeared in the first minute. What greeted the traveler was not spiritual peace, but an olfactory attack, mixing the greasy smell of roasted meat with the unmistakable metallic odor of fresh blood. The house of God functioned in practice as a slaughter industry on a massive scale. The logistics required to sacrifice thousands of lambs in a single day transformed the temple into something we would recognize today more as an industrial slaughterhouse than a church. Priests worked barefoot on the slippery stone floor, their robes stained, in a frenetic rhythm of cutting and offering. There was even a specific hydraulic engineering system for this. Drainage channels carried excess blood out of the complex, dyeing the stream in the Kidron Valley red. The perfume of the holy city was, ironically, the smell of death. But if the nose suffered from the slaughter, The ears suffered from the commerce. The court of the Gentiles, the outermost area of the temple, had nothing sacred about it. It was a noisy and aggressive bazaar that operated as the nation's central bank. Since Roman currency with Caesar's face was considered blasphemy and could not be used to pay the temple tax, money changers charged abusive fees to exchange it for the accepted currency, the Tyrian shekel. The sound of coins falling on tables mixed with the shouts of dove sellers and the bleating of sheep, creating a deafening cacophony. This explains Jesus' fury when overturning the tables. He didn't interrupt a silent service. He stopped a corrupt stock exchange that exploited the faith of poor pilgrims who had traveled days to be there. Besides trade and blood, there was demographic chaos. During festivals, the city's population tripled. Inns filled up months in advance, and the solution for most was to sleep in the streets, on flat roofs, or in makeshift camps around the walls. The holy city became a powder keg of sweaty, tired, and financially exploited people. Every city generates trash, but a city that sacrifices thousands of animals and hosts crowds generates a specific type of waste that needs to be discarded. And the final destination of all this filth was a place so terrible and smoking that it eventually became the visual synonym for eternal damnation. Looking south from the walls of Jerusalem, a column of black, greasy smoke rose constantly toward the sky, day and night. The smell coming from there was unbearable, a mixture of sulfur, burning trash, and animal carcasses. This place was not a myth. It was a real geographical location called the Valley of Hinnom, or in Greek, Gehenna. For a first-century inhabitant, hell was not just an abstract concept of future suffering. It was the city dump they could see and smell every day. It was there that the city discarded everything it considered useless: food scraps, rubble, and even the bodies of executed criminals who did not deserve a dignified burial. The fire never went out because the trash never stopped arriving. When Jesus used the word Gehenna to describe damnation, he was using a powerful visual image that any peasant understood immediately. The place where life is discarded and consumed. But ancient cities didn't just discard physical waste. They also segregated what they considered human trash. Outside the gates, living in caves or makeshift camps, were the lepers. Skin disease, which could be anything from psoriasis to modern Hansen's disease, was a sentence of social death. By religious law, they were forbidden from entering walled villages. The cruelty of the isolation was sonic. If a leper needed to walk near a road or saw someone approaching, he had the legal obligation to shout the word tameh, which means unclean. It was a human alarm to ensure no one got close. The healthy population's greatest fear was not just bacteriological contagion, something they didn't even understand well, but ritual contamination. In that society, touch was dangerous. Touching a leper, a corpse, or even a woman during her menstrual cycle made you spiritually radioactive. Whoever touched the unclean became unclean as well, being forbidden from entering the temple or participating in community life until undergoing purification rituals. This created invisible walls between people, where compassion was braked by the fear of becoming an outcast. Jewish society lived under the crushing weight of these purity rules, trying to maintain holiness at any cost. But there was another weight, much more tangible and brutal, that crushed the pocket and dignity of every worker, coming directly from an empire that didn't care about purity, only gold. If you walked through the streets of Capernaum and looked into people's eyes, you would perceive a constant tension, a silent anger that hung in the air like static electricity. The reason for this was not just poverty, but the daily humiliation of living under foreign occupation. Rome was not just a distant government. It was a heavy hand that reached into your pocket and your dignity every day. Tax collection didn't happen once a year via a discreet bill. It was a physical and daily confrontation. Imagine being a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee. Before selling your fish, you needed to pass through local customs, where a publican, a Jew hired by Rome like Matthew, rummaged through your baskets. He had the power to decide right there how much of your hard work would be confiscated to pay for the emperor's luxury on the other side of the sea. But money was only part of the problem. There was a specific Roman law that generated visceral hatred in the streets. The law of the mile. Any Roman soldier, at any time, could stop a Jewish citizen in the middle of the road, throw his heavy baggage at his feet, and order,
"Pick it up.
"Carry this."
We march."
And by law, the civilian was obliged to carry that burden for a mile, about 1.5 kilometers. It was the supreme humiliation. A father of a family could be treated like a beast of burden in front of his children, forced to serve the army that oppressed him. That is why, when Jesus said, "If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him too," the crowd must have been in shock. He was suggesting retaking control of the situation through challenging generosity, in a context where forced submission was the norm. And where did all this money and sweat go? It didn't stay in the poor villages. It flowed to places like Caesarea Maritima, the seat of the Roman government in the region. A dazzling port city built with marble and advanced engineering, with hippodromes and temples dedicated to Caesar. For a Jewish peasant, seeing that opulence was physical proof of his own exploitation. Imperial architecture brought roads and aqueducts, but the price was the hunger of the people. The city was a powder keg, ready to explode in revolt at any moment. But while the day brought the tension of soldiers and taxes, sunset brought a different type of fear. A primitive terror that we moderns have completely forgotten. For us moderns, night is just a change of scenery. We flip a switch and life goes on. But if you were in Jerusalem or Nazareth in the 1st century, sunset did not mark the end of the shift. It marked the beginning of a mandatory confinement by fear. When the last light disappeared on the horizon, the city didn't just get dark, it died. The darkness of that time was absolute, something we rarely experience today with our light pollution. There was no public lighting, except perhaps for the occasional torches of a Roman patrol, which served more to intimidate than to illuminate. Inside houses, light was an expensive luxury. Clay lamps burned olive oil, the same oil used for cooking. Keeping a light on meant, literally, burning the family's food. Therefore, most people simply went to sleep as soon as it got dark. This darkness brought a fatal logistical danger. Walled cities had an inflexible rule. Gates were locked at dusk. If you were a late traveler and arrived 5 minutes after closing, there was no negotiation. You would sleep outside, leaning against the wall, completely vulnerable to bandits, wolves, and the desert cold. The wall was the only dividing line between civilization and savage chaos. Even for those inside the house, safety was illusory. Today, we think of burglars breaking down doors or breaking windows. But in those villages of simple construction, criminals acted differently. The Greek term used at the time for a thief often referred to someone who digs. This is because it was easier and quieter to dig a hole through the dry mud wall at the back of the house than to try to force the front door. The night terror was hearing the muffled sound of something scratching the wall while you tried to sleep. This changes the way we understand biblical metaphors. When light of the world, or walking in the light, was spoken of, the message didn't sound just poetic or spiritual to the original listeners. It sounded like an urgent physical necessity. Light was the only guarantee that you wouldn't be attacked, robbed, or left outside the walls. But while the people feared the darkness of the night, which always ended at dawn, a definitive shadow was forming on the political horizon. A storm of iron and fire that would bring not just fear, but the total end of that world they knew. Whoever walks near the Wailing Wall today sees gigantic stones, some weighing hundreds of tons, fitted with a precision that defies even modern engineering. Looking at them, the sensation is of eternity. It seemed impossible that something so solid could fall. But that vibrant, dirty, and noisy world we have described so far had an expiration date. In the year 70 AD, the apocalypse arrived. Not with angels and trumpets, but with the iron legions of Rome. The tension that boiled in the streets under tax collection and military brutality finally exploded in open revolt. The empire's response was total annihilation. General Titus surrounded Jerusalem, cutting off the supply from those caravans that brought food. The city, which once smelled of spices and animals, began to smell of death. Famine reached such a desperate level that historical accounts describe scenes of cannibalism within the walls. The society that valued ritual purity so much ended up consuming itself in the filth of the siege. When the walls finally gave way, fire did the rest. The temple, that economic and religious center that seemed untouchable, was set on fire. The heat was so intense that the gold of the decorations melted and ran into the crevices of the stones, causing Roman soldiers to dismantle the sanctuary block by block to loot the precious metal. It was the literal and terrifying fulfillment of the prediction that not one stone would be left upon another. There is physical proof of this moment that does not depend on faith, only a shovel. If you dig into the subsoil of the old city today, you will find what experts call the destruction layer. It is a black line of ashes, charred wood, and Roman arrowheads that marks exactly where that civilization stopped. The collapse of the stones led to the collapse of the elite. The Sadducees, that wealthy aristocracy that controlled the temple trade, disappeared from history overnight as their power base turned to smoke. Those who survived were precisely the groups that did not depend on the physical building. The Pharisees, who focused on studying the law in local synagogues, and the followers of the Way, the first Christians, who understood that the real temple was not made of rock. Walking there today is walking over the cemetery of a culture that tried to challenge heaven and the empire at the same time. Herod's stones fell, but the ideas that were born in those narrow, dusty streets survived the fire. If you want to continue exploring the secrets of antiquity that traditional history doesn't tell, click here on the screen to watch our documentary on what real life was like before the flood. Click on the video on the screen to discover what it was like to live in a lost world.